the King of Sparta did not meet his end on a glorious battlefield, surrounded by fallen enemies. Instead, he was locked away in a dark, damp cell, handed a crude iron blade, and methodically dismantled himself piece by piece until there was absolutely nothing left. This terrifying act of self-destruction belonged to the very man who sat on the throne just before the legendary Leonidas. But to understand how history reached this breaking point, we have to look past the shining myths of bronze shields and immortal warriors. The stories always show us the hero who marched 300 men to a narrow mountain pass to hold back an empire. They show us the ultimate sacrifice, but they never show us the monster. Because Leonidas was not born a hero, he was designed. He was systematically broken and rebuilt by the most ruthless and efficient training machine the ancient world ever conceived. And the darkest secret of all is that Leonidas was never supposed to wear the crown. He was the spare, the shadow, a younger brother thrown into a brutal dehumanization factory at just 7 years old. While his older brothers were pampered in the palace, he was left to starve, freeze, and endure unimaginable hardship. He had to survive a society gripped by a paralyzing paranoia, a place that trained its children to hunt in the dark, just to keep its own massive captive population from rising up and wiping them out while they slept. Before Leonidas could face a foreign god-king on the battlefield, he had to watch his own royal family consume itself in jealousy, exile, and the horrific, blade-wielding madness inside that dark cell. To understand how you forge a human weapon, what you have to sacrifice, and what part of your own soul you have to erase to become Sparta's living legend, we must go back to the beginning. We must enter the nightmare that gave birth to him. Sparta was not a city of philosophers, poets, or shining marble theaters like Athens. It was an austere, primitive rock, and it existed in a constant, paralyzing state of terror. But the Spartans weren't afraid of foreign empires. They were terrified of their own backyard. The pure Spartans were a tiny, isolated elite, holding their boots firmly to the necks of a massive captive population that outnumbered them 10-1. If these subjugated masses ever got half a chance, they would have wiped Sparta off the map before dawn. So, the Spartans answered that fear with absolute suppression. They created a secret police force, sending their youth into the pitch-black night to hunt down the strongest and most rebellious of their captives. It was how they taught their children to extinguish human life in the dark. This was the paranoid, iron-fisted world Leonidas was born into around 540 BC. He had royal heritage, belonging to one of Sparta's 2 ruling families. But royal lineage in Sparta did not buy luxury. It did not buy comfort. And crucially for Leonidas, he was not the firstborn. He was the third. He was the spare. And because he was not the direct heir, at 7 years old, he was torn from his mother's arms and thrown into the Agoge. It wasn't a school. It was a 13-year dehumanization factory designed to burn away individualism, compassion, and fear, leaving only one thing behind: absolute obedience. Think of the most grueling special forces training on Earth. But imagine it starts when you are a child and lasts over a decade. He was given a single tunic a year, no shoes, neither in the scorching summer heat nor the freezing winter ice. They were deliberately kept on the edge of starvation to encourage them to steal food. But the psychological trap was ruthless. They weren't punished for stealing. They were savagely beaten for the incompetence of being caught. Older boys were placed in charge of the younger ones, creating a brutal hierarchy of institutionalized abuse. The goal was to make pain irrelevant. Most children would shatter under this pressure, becoming soulless drones. But Leonidas thrived. Where others saw cruelty, he found a limit to push. He learned to weaponize hunger, cold, and pain. He mastered the Spartan ideal of speaking only when vital. Using words that struck like a physical blow, he was being forged into a cold, disciplined, and entirely lethal instrument of the state. But while Leonidas was fighting for a crust of hard bread in the barracks, a toxic war of succession was brewing in the royal palace. His father had 3 sons who mattered. The eldest, Cleomenes, was the heir, and because he was the heir, he was entirely exempt from the horrors of the Agoge. He was pampered and raised as a prince, while his younger brothers were raised as wolves. The second son, Dorieus, endured the Agoge. He grew strong, arrogant, and deeply resentful of his older brother, a man who had earned nothing but was poised to inherit everything. And then there was Leonidas, the shadow, watching in silence. Around 520 BC, the old king passes, and the pampered Cleomenes takes the throne. For the hardened warrior, Dorieus, kneeling before a brother he despises as weak as unbearable, unable to stomach the humiliation, Dorieus chooses self-imposed exile. He sails away to forge his own kingdom, only to be ambushed and eliminated in a foreign land. The second in line is gone. Now, absolute power rests entirely on Cleomenes, and power has a way of revealing the truth. The new king is not just incompetent, he is dangerously volatile. He starts unsanctioned conflicts. He bribes the sacred oracles. His fragile brilliance quickly rots into paranoid lunacy. Eventually, the king's erratic behavior threatens the very survival of the state. The Spartan magistrates officially declare him insane. The reigning king of Sparta is arrested, chained in stocks, and publicly humiliated like a rabid animal. And then comes the dark, credibly convenient official story. The very next morning, they find Cleomenes lifeless in his cell. The state claims he begged a guard for a blade and brought about his own horrific end, carving himself away until there was nothing left. Was it truly the tragic end of a broken mind, or was it a quiet, necessary removal of a mad king who had become a fatal liability? The truth was buried with him, but the result was undeniable. The pampered firstborn was gone. The arrogant secondborn had fallen in a distant land, and so the boy thrown to the wolves at 7 years old, the man who survived the most brutal system on earth, outlived them all. Around 490 BC, Leonidas, the spare who was never supposed to rule, placed the crown upon his own head. Sparta had just put its most perfect, dangerous creation in absolute control, and the timing couldn't have been more critical, because far to the east, a storm was gathering, and a king of kings was looking toward Greece, ready to unleash unimaginable devastation. Far across the known world, in a palace larger than the entirety of Sparta, sat a man who did not rule 20,000 warriors, but 70 million souls, Xerxes, the Shahanshah, the King of Kings. He had wrapped himself in silk his entire life. The world served to him on a silver platter, and he was obsessed with erasing Greece from the map. He spent a decade assembling an invasion force so massive it defied logic, a human tide so vast it drank entire rivers dry. Before the swords were drawn, Xerxes unleashed the diplomacy of terror. He sent emissaries to every Greek city-state, demanding earth and water, the ultimate symbol of absolute submission. City after city broke under the pressure. The great Greek alliance was crumbling before a single arrow took flight. When the King of Kings' messengers arrived in Sparta, they made the exact same demand. But Leonidas, the man forged in the brutal fires of the Agoge, the master of the economy of words, did not negotiate. He grabbed the emissaries, dragged them to the edge of a deep pit, and sent them plummeting into the dark abyss. "Find it yourselves," was the message. He had just signed a death warrant for all of Greece. The panic among the remaining free cities was absolute. They needed a plan to survive extinction. The strategy was presented a two-front defense. The Athenian fleet would block the straits, but they desperately needed to stall the endless Persian infantry on land. In an open field, the vast numbers of the invaders' cavalry would trample them to dust. They needed a bottleneck, a claustrophobic nightmare where 1,000,000 men were worth no more than 100. They chose Thermopylae, the hot gates, a narrow mountain pass with a sheer cliff dropping straight into the sea. But when Leonidas asked the Spartan magistrates for permission to mobilize the army, they refused. A sacred religious festival was underway. Marching to war was sacrilege. Greece was about to burn, entirely because of a festival. But the Agoge taught Leonidas how to find cracks in the system. The law said the army couldn't march. It said nothing about the king's personal guard. He gathered his 300 elite guardsmen, but he issued one final, chilling order before they departed. Only men who already had living sons were permitted to march. He knew this wasn't a vanguard. This wasn't a reconnaissance mission. He was intentionally selecting men whose family lines were already secured, because he was orchestrating a mass, ritualized sacrifice. Leonidas and his small coalition marched north and stood at the hot gates, barely 7,000 Greeks in total. Soon, the earth began to shake. The scouts returned pale, their eyes crazed with terror, reporting a force so immense that their arrows would blot out the sun. Xerxes himself arrived in his war chariot, utterly furious at the sheer arrogance of the tiny force blocking his path. He sent one final offer: hand over your weapons, and you will be spared. Imagine standing on that front line. The dust of 1,000,000 marching men fills your lungs. The ground is trembling. If you were standing at those narrow gates, facing an endless sea of adversaries, would you lay down your weapons to save your own life? Or would you lock your shield and stand your ground, knowing it is an absolute one-way trip? Pause the video right now. Comment your decision below. I want to know what you would do. With the final offer rejected by Leonidas's immortal 2 words, "Come and take them," the god-king's rage shattered his arrogance. At dawn on the 5th day, Xerxes unleashed the assault. He sent 10,000 troops from his subjugated nations, men who fought out of fear, not loyalty. They crashed like a fragile wave against the Spartan phalanx. This was exactly what the brutal training of the Agoge had designed them for, not as individuals, but as an unbreakable machine, a porcupine of bronze, wood, and hardened muscle. The first row locked their heavy shields, leaving 0 gaps. The rows behind lowered their massive spears over the shoulders of the men in front. It was a 3-layered wall of absolute ruin. The invaders' wicker shields and cloth armor disintegrated. They fell in droves, unable to even get close enough to strike. Leonidas, standing at the very front, roared the command for the push. The Spartans surged forward as one, the invaders in the rear, unable to see the devastation, kept pushing forward, while the men in the front were crushed against the unyielding bronze wall, entirely trapped by their own immense numbers. Humiliated, Xerxes called off the first wave and unleashed his nightmare force, the Immortals. 10,000 elite, heavily armored shock troops. The clash was deafening. The line bent, but the phalanx held. In the middle of the infernal chaos, Leonidas executed the most disciplined tactical deception in military history. He shouted an order, and the Spartans broke line. They turned and fled. Panic and triumph gripped the Immortals. They broke their own ranks and surged forward in pursuit. But it was a trap, in perfect unison. The fleeing Spartans spun around, locking their shields and spears instantly. The Immortals had charged blindly into a sudden, inescapable wall of iron. Discipline obliterated chaos. By the time the sun set, the narrow throat of the pass was piled high with the fallen. The largest force the world had ever seen was entirely paralyzed by a single monster of a king. For 2 entire days, the immense invasion force was completely paralyzed. The God-King was desperate, humiliated by a handful of stubborn fanatics. The unbreakable bronze wall could not be breached from the front. But the turning point of Western civilization didn't come from a brilliant tactical maneuver or an overpowering cavalry charge. It came from a local shepherd, a trader named Ephialtes. He approached Xerxes not with a weapon, but with a secret worth an empire hidden. Winding goat path that bypassed the hot gates entirely and spilled out directly behind the Spartan line. Xerxes didn't hesitate. Under the gear of total darkness, he sent his elite immortals creeping through the oak forests. The Phocian guards, stationed on the Pao, startled by a sudden volley of arrows emerging from the mist, panicked and fled into the hills. The path was left wide open. The ultimate trap was finally closing. When the scouts brought the devastating news to Leonidas, he wasn't surprised. He had expected this. The oracle at Delphi had given him a chilling prophecy before he ever marched. Either Sparta would be reduced to ashes, or it would mourn the loss of a king. Destiny had come to collect its debt. In a moment of supreme, calculating clarity, Leonidas issued his final commands. He ordered the bulk of the Greek coalition to retreat, to save themselves so they could defend their cities another day. Their job wasn't to throw their lives away pointlessly, but Leonidas, his 300 Spartans, 700 fiercely loyal Thespians, and 400 Theban hostages remained. They were now surrounded by 250,000 adversaries. Leonidas removed his helmet. breathed in the cold morning air, and looked at the men who had followed him into the abyss. There was no more strategy. There was no more wall to hold. He shouted the final, legendary order to prepare their breakfast and eat well. For tonight, they would dine in the underworld. But they didn't hold the line and wait for the end. They abandoned the safety of the bottleneck and charged straight into the absolute center of the Persian vanguard. It was pure, unleashing fury. They shattered their spears on the enemy lines, drew their short swords, and pressed deeper into the massive horde. Leonidas fought with a terrifying, unrelenting ferocity, carving a path through the elite ranks until, finally, the Spartan king fell. But the clash didn't end there. What followed was a desperate, primal struggle for the king's fallen form. 4 separate times the invaders surged forward to claim Leonidas, and 4 times the remaining Spartans repelled them, striking down 2 of Xerxes' own brothers in the chaos. The surviving warriors, utterly exhausted and wielding broken blades, dragged their king to a small hill. When their weapons shattered, they fought with their bare hands. When their hands gave out, they fought with their teeth, unable to break their spirit in close combat. Xerxes gave the final, cowardly order. He commanded his archers to unleash a storm so dense it darkened the sun, silencing the last defenders from afar. When the dust finally settled, the narrow pass was deafeningly quiet. Xerxes walked among the fallen, seeking the center of his rage. He found Leonidas in a fit of deeply impotent fury. The god-king broke every sacred law of the ancient world. He ordered the Spartan king's head removed and his remains mounted on a pike for all to see. It was the ultimate insult, meant to erase the king's dignity entirely. But Xerxes made a fatal miscalculation. By desecrating the fallen, he didn't erase Leonidas, he made him immortal. The surviving runners raced south, and the story they carried wasn't one of a crushing defeat. It was a story of glorious, impossible defiance. Leonidas had bought the one thing Xerxes' infinite wealth could never purchase: time. Time for the brilliant Athenian strategists to position their massive fleet. Time to evacuate their cities. And most importantly, time for the paralyzing terror of Greece to transform into an uncontrollable, scorching vengeance. Weeks later, the Greek naval forces, burning with the memory of the hot gates, utterly devastated the Persian armada at Salamis, permanently severing the invaders' supply lines. A year later, a fully mobilized Spartan army marched to Plataea, not to defend, but to avenge. They shattered the remnants of the invasion force forever. Leonidas was not a philosopher, nor was he a gentle ruler. He was a terrifying entity, forged by the most brutal, unforgiving system the ancient world had ever seen. The Agoge stripped him of his compassion and his individuality, leaving only a perfect instrument of war. But in the darkest hour of the ancient world, that flawless, ruthless instrument became the indestructible shield of Western civilization. The story of the Hot Gates is always told as a shining triumph of freedom over tyranny, but the chilling truth is that the men who saved a free world were not entirely free themselves. Leonidas was a product of absolute terror. a spare heir who survived a childhood of calculated starvation and institutionalized trauma, only to rule over a society built entirely on the ruthless subjugation of others. Yet, when the ancient world was on the brink of total erasure, it wasn't the poets, the artists, or the philosophers who held the line against the infinite horde. It was the monsters of Sparta. The god King Xerxes believed he could crush them with sheer numbers. But he fundamentally misunderstood his enemy. He didn't realize that you cannot break men who were already shattered and rebuilt in the dark. If this journey into the brutal, unforgiving reality behind the Spartan myth changed your perspective on history, hit that like button. It tells me you want more of the unvarnished truth, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell right now. You will not want to miss the next time we pull back the curtain on the darkest, most carefully hidden secrets of the past. The Spartan mothers always gave one final, unyielding command to their sons: come back with your shield, or on it. Leonidas returned with neither, but the terrifying, unbroken legend he left behind became the shield that protected the rest of history.